If you've watched the other videos on my channel, you know that I love the GH4. Most of the time I film my own YouTube videos on my GH4. However, this one I'm actually filming on the Ursa Mini just because we have it on this shoot in Chicago. But I want to talk about why I love the GH4 so much, because as much as I praise it, much as I say it's a great camera, I think there's still people out there who don't quite get it, and they look at the faults and they look at the downsides. Oh, the sensor's too small. Oh, you know, there's not as good a lenses as Canon has, or whatever the reasons are. They look at all the cons and they don't look at the pros or understand why it is so great and such a powerful tool for filmmakers, for video production specialists, for anyone who does video of any kind. I think the GH4 is an awesome camera. It's not the best camera, but in some cases it is the best all-around camera. And there's a couple reasons for that, and I want to go through my list of why I think the GH4 is so freaking awesome. The first thing that I love about the GH4, and it's not even the most important thing, but it's just the size. The thing is so freaking small and compact that you can put it pretty much anywhere. You can take it anywhere. It's light, it travels easy, and if you want to rig it out, you can. And that's why it's not the most important thing to me that it's small, but it is a really nice benefit that it is so tiny and compact. You can put it on a drone, you can put it on a gimbal, you can put it in your backpack and take it abroad if you're traveling the world. It can go anywhere and do pretty much anything, aside from something even smaller, which maybe would be your iPhone or your smartphone that you can put in your pocket. But as far as a professional camera that can shoot 4K video, the thing is really tiny. An often overlooked feature on the GH4 that I absolutely love is the ability to set shutter angle. Now, I don't have time to get into shutter angle in this video because it takes a little bit of explaining to cover adequately, but I've made some other videos talking about shutter angle and why I like it so much. But the GH4 is great because you can actually pick to use shutter angle instead of shutter speed. Now, this is very uncommon in DSLR cameras, hybrid cameras, and mirrorless cameras in general. Most of them don't let you use this professional video feature of setting shutter angle. They limit you to shutter speed, which is fine, but I think it's a lot more inconvenient to use shutter speed instead of shutter angle. The GH4 also has a built-in time-lapse mode, and it assembles the time lapses into movies in the camera. Now, this is becoming more and more common on a lot of different cameras, but not all of them are even offering it yet. So when the GH4 shipped almost 3 years ago, this was a huge feature for me because I love doing time lapses, especially on a camera like the GH4, which is a hybrid. It's meant for video and photo. So being able to do proper time lapses with all your photo settings and being able to assemble that into a previewable movie file in the camera, take it right into editing, it's amazing. Most other cameras, you got to take the JPEGs or the RAW files and process them through After Effects, which is what I typically use. You could also use Lightroom or different software to process that, but it takes so much time. You have so many files to go through, and then it's slowing you down. You can't see it in the field. I remember I used to do time lapses on the 5D Mark II, and I would sit there with the scroll wheel going through the photos to see a kind of rough idea of how the time lapse would look. On the GH4, it's a movie file. You just hit play, and it's right there. Another huge advantage to the GH4 is that it's mirrorless, and this gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of lenses. Yes, there aren't as many lenses for Micro Four Thirds as there are for some other camera systems, but there are quite a few, and there's some really good native lenses. But good thing is, they make all sorts of lens adapters. Because it's a mirrorless camera, you can put pretty much any lens that's ever been made on the thing. I have a PL mount, so I can put PL lenses on my GH4. I can put Nikon, I can put Canon, I can put Pentax, I can put contacts, old Zeiss contacts glass on there. Anything can pretty much fit on there, aside from some other mirrorless lenses. But let's face it, I mean, if you buy the mirrorless lenses, they're probably for that other system. So I have a lot of old Nikon glass that I love to use on my GH4. I've got a bunch of Canon glass that I can use on there, and it just gives you so much flexibility, especially for people who are on a budget and they want to use some more affordable glass that you can pick up on eBay for $100, $200, $300 instead of spending, you know, $1,000 or $2,000 on the modern day equivalent lens for that system. And there's just so much flexibility in being able to use a mirrorless camera. Speaking of it being mirrorless, this also gives it the ability to use some more higher end adapters like speed boosters, also commonly referred to as lens turbos. Basically, they're focal reducers, and what they do is they take the image from a full frame lens and they shrink it down for the smaller sensor. And what that does is it gives you that Super 35 look on the GH4. A lot of people give the GH4 a hard time for being a 2x crop sensor, being micro four thirds. That's not big enough. I tend to agree. I would like a bigger sensor in a GH type camera, but you can work around it because it's mirrorless. You can use a speed booster, which is what I have, and I can take full frame glass or Super 35 glass and put it on the GH4 and get that Super 35 look. So there's a lot of people who love APS-C cameras and Super 35 cameras, and they don't understand that you can use a speed booster to get the same look on the GH4, and it really is the same look. Same field of view, same depth of field, and you get a brighter aperture out of it. It's a really handy thing to have in your bag, and they are kind of expensive at around $600, so you're looking at almost over half the cost of the camera at this point for this added upgrade. But when you look at the cost of micro four thirds cameras compared to APS-C cameras, oftentimes there is an additional cost factor when you're looking at the bigger sensors. It's not always the case, and I will have to say, if they had a bigger sensor in a mirrorless camera like Sony does, where they have their APS-C mirrorless cameras, you could use a speed booster to actually get to full frame look, which would be nice to have. But sadly, on the GH4, we are stuck with Super 35, although many people will say that is an industry standard and pretty much all you need. You look at the new 5D Mark IV that's been announced, and it has a full frame sensor in there, but for 4K, they've gone for the crop mode, which is totally fine because it gets you a Super 35 look, and a lot of people are saying that's all you need. So if all you need from the 5D Mark IV is Super 35, I think you should be happy with Super 35 from a GH4. One of the best but most often overlooked features on the GH4 is that it doesn't overheat. And that's coming from somebody who films in Arizona. I live in Arizona. It is hot. Trust me, I've been out doing time lapses and production out in the heat, and the camera has not once overheated on me. I'm sure if you put it in an oven, you could probably get it to break, but I have never been on a shoot and had a problem with the camera overheating. Now, if you compare this to a lot of other hybrid cameras nowadays, overheating is a common problem. Even on older generation cameras that were only doing 1080p, they still would overheat when you got up to temperatures around 100 degrees. So for a camera that shoots 4K to not overheat, it's just that reliability factor is so valuable because the camera is always going to work. The battery life on the GH4 is also awesome. It's right around that sweet spot of, I'd say, 2 to 3 hours of active filming, where then after 2 or 3 hours you got to swap batteries, which at some point you're going to have to swap batteries. But for batteries that are this size, they're really cheap. I'll put a link down in the description to the batteries I use. I use the Wasabi ones. You get like 2 for the price of like a half of an official one, and they work awesome. They hold just as good of a charge, and they've been nothing but a pleasure to work with. And the GH4 is great because you can have a couple batteries laying around, and you don't have to have as many as you do with some of the Sony cameras that tend to not have the greatest battery life. It's a huge advantage to have a camera that doesn't need constant attention in terms of battery life, where you can walk around with it for a day just casually taking photos or video and know that that battery is going to last. Let's also not forget that the GH4 was one of the first, if not the first, consumer camera to offer 4K. Nowadays, that's not as big of a selling feature, but when it came out, that was pretty revolutionary. You had a resolution that was previously only limited to high-end cameras like professional filmmaking cinematography cameras like Reds and some Aries, which even were sticking with 1080p for a while, and some of the high-end Sony cameras. Panasonic really brought 4K to the masses, and it's one of the first selling points of the camera. But it's lower on my list because nowadays it's not that special. A lot of cameras offer 4K, but the 4K that you get out of the GH4 is really nice. And there's a lot of people who talk about, people not even watching content in 4K, and I don't really think that's that big of a factor. You really should be acquiring your footage in 4K regardless of if people are only watching it in 1080p. It gives you flexibility in post, you can crop, you can reframe, you can sample down for that true 1080p resolution. There's just a lot of advantages to shooting in 4K, especially with a codec on the GH4, because let's face it, not all the time, you don't always want RAW, you don't always want the largest file sizes. So having an efficient codec like the GH4 has, where it's 100 megabits per second in 4K mode, gives you high quality resolution, great looking footage, but with file sizes that are manageable. On a 64 gig card, shooting 4K around 100 megabits per second, that's about an hour and 24 minutes of recording time for 64 gigs. I think it's worth it. The GH4 also has some really cool features that granted, not everyone's going to use, but I love that they're there. They added a 4x3 anamorphic mode, which if you've never shot anamorphic, I definitely recommend you try it out. It's not for everyone. It's a little bit slower. It's not always the best image quality in some cases, but it's definitely an aesthetic that some people like to use, and being able to use 2x anamorphics on a GH4 so you get proper CinemaScope looking footage is so nice to have, especially on a hybrid camera. There are professional cameras, professional high-end thousands of dollar cameras that don't even have this. So for Panasonic to introduce a 4x3 anamorphic mode via firmware update for free, it's just another awesome feature to have in your tool set. So if you want to shoot anamorphic with PL lenses or with anamorphic adapters, you can go right ahead and do it on the GH4. They also released a firmware update for Vlog L, so you can shoot log on the GH4, which wasn't standard out of the box when it shipped from the factory originally. Now, I do have a little bit of an issue with this one because they did charge $100 for the upgrade, and the upgrade process was incredibly complicated, way more complicated than it had to be. They were using snail mail and all sorts of nonsense that you don't need to use anymore for a firmware update. But I do appreciate the fact that the GH4 finally did get a log recording mode for 12 stops of dynamic range. Now, if I had to criticize the GH4, it's that the dynamic range could be better. There's a lot of other cameras that are coming out now where it's around 14, 15 stops of dynamic range, and I really think that the GH5 hopefully heads in that direction, or future cameras from Panasonic add to the dynamic range. But 12 is certainly usable in a lot of different situations, and even though it doesn't always work, it's usually pretty good. And having that log ability, it's not always the best for internal recording, but if you have an external recorder, it's a great tool to have. Another option that you can use or not use depending. And that's what I love so much about the GH4 is that there's all these different options. So depending on how you like to film, whether you like to film in 4K or 1080, or you like to film log or not log, you want to shoot anamorphic or you don't want to shoot anamorphic, you can do all of these different things and choose what works best for you and your project. There's so many things to love about the GH4, but one that I find particularly helpful, especially for me and my YouTube channel, is the flexibility of the LCD screen. It's articulating, so you can flip it any different direction. And there's a lot of different cameras now that have, articulating screens, but a lot of times they only flip up or down, or they only flip to the side. I've never been in a situation where I've had to use the GH4 screen and not been able to see it. This is a perfect example right now. I'm using the Ursa Mini to film this, and it has an LCD screen that looks exactly the same as the articulating one on the GH4, except I can't flip this screen around to see myself. So on a GH4, I normally would flip this around so I could see what I look like, my framing, set all my settings. But because this has an articulating screen that doesn't flip all the way around, I have to have someone else set up, get focused, do the whole thing for me. That's a hassle and a pain for the way I like to shoot. And just having that flexibility, again, it's all about the versatility of the tool. And that's why I think the GH4 is so great all around, because you get all these features in one body that's incredibly cheap. That's another huge advantage of the GH4 is just the price. A lot of these features are mirrored across other devices. Now, a lot of other devices have better features or less features, or combinations of the two. But the GH4 has so much of this in such an affordable body. They're down to around $1,000 right now. That is so incredibly cheap for such a powerful tool. Last thing I'll say about the GH4 is that I love the fact that it records to SD cards, because SD cards are incredibly cheap and they keep getting cheaper. I just heard that there's now a terabyte SD card that they're coming out with. I'm sure it's expensive, but all it means is that the other smaller SD cards get a little bit cheaper, and that's really nice. You can buy 64 gig, 128, 256. In some cases, you can find the SD cards that make the most sense for you, and there's not proprietary media like there used to be with P2 cards. I think they still make P2 cards, but I don't want to shoot on a camera that takes P2 cards. And now they're coming out with CFast cards that are great and non-proprietary, but there's still a lot of other cameras using compact flash or XQD. SD cards, so simple, so basic. You can find them pretty much anywhere. If you need cards, you can go to Best Buy and pick some up, and they'll work in the camera. That alone is such a huge advantage, because no matter what, you're going to be able to find media to record to at very cost-effective prices. So that's why I love the GH4 so much. I know a lot of these features are probably pretty common knowledge to anyone who's been watching my channel, but I did think it was important to put together a video talking about why I love the camera so much. I've talked about other videos where I think, there's things that Panasonic could do better with their GH cameras. Bigger sensors, better dynamic range, better low light, more frame rate options. There are ways to improve upon it. But when I look at the camera marketplace, price to value ratio, nothing really stands out quite like the GH4 in terms of bang for buck and the value for your dollars. And so that's why when it first came out, I was one of the first people to have one and started shooting on it immediately. and I have not regretted it since. It's been such a valuable tool, and it hasn't been perfect in every situation, but this Ursa Mini that I'm shooting on right now is not as flexible and as versatile as the GH4, even though it's 5 times the cost. There's some additional features that it has, but it's not the tool that's going to work all the time like the GH4 is. And I think that's pretty incredible that Panasonic was able to pack so much power in such a tiny package for such a cheap price, considering some of these features are only reserved for the highest of the high end. And having it in a $1,000 camera body, how could you be upset at that?